Welcome to the Strength Connection podcast, a show to share stories, insights, and experiences in strength, physically, mentally, and spiritually. I'm Michael Kurkowski, host of the Strength Connection, and I'm so grateful that you can join me today. So in these episodes, I connect with some of the most inspiring and successful individuals to chop it up and learn from true life experiences that help them become who they are, the strongest versions of themselves. One of the greatest ways I've always learned the most important lessons is through stories. We all have them, and they make us who we are. So let's dive in. Here we go. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Strength Connection podcast, and Dr. Jeremy Koenig. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Happy New Year to you. I'm really grateful that you took some time to do this for me.
My pleasure, Michael.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So shout out to our mutual friend, Eric Malzone, for connecting us. So I got to tell you, Jeremy, when we first connected, I really didn't know much about really the term genomics and metagenomics of getting in. And after doing some research on that, this is such a fascinating topic for that whole broader spectrum of human optimization and our potential in here. So I'm really curious to get into your journey and really get into the deep insights in here. So usually I start with the journey, but just for a little kind of science 101 question in here. Metagenomics, it's a big word that we have. If you can just describe what that is and how does that affect us in terms of our human potential for strength and optimization?
Yeah. So this is about to get very meta, as the name implies, right? Yep. And so, like, listeners be warned, it'll take us a bit of a philosophical loop, but it'll bring us back to the point, hopefully, because as I foreshadowed, is metagenomics is really it's the genomes of everything on Earth, and really you can think of it as, I guess, the study of genetic material recovered directly from environmental samples. And this is an important distinction because compared to traditional genomics, which focuses more on the study of, say, the individual genome, a single species, so like a human or a plant or a rat or whatever, metagenomics allows for the analysis of a collective genome, and most predominantly microorganisms from a particular community. So think the gut microbiome as an example. So the reason why that's really interesting is because, well, in our guts, you probably heard we've got, I can't remember what the number is, say 10 times more bacteria living in us and on us than there are human cells.
Right.
Some people would posit that we're just kind of these walking incubators for the sake of our bacteria. Hopefully not. But if you were to try to, conventionally or historically, the way we would get information on any of these probiotics, or indeed any of the pathogens, like killer pathogens like cholera, for example, you'd have to isolate them in pure culture first, grow enough of them so you have biomass to extract the genome, and then sequence it to get some kind of insight around what that bug did. But the interesting thing that we know, microbiologists know, is that, well, there's this whole uncultivatable majority. It's like 99.9% of bugs in your gut can't be isolated on their own, let's say, because there are these communities, these ecosystems of synergy. And so previous to the advent of metagenomics, which is really like, it's a shotgun approach, right? It's like I can take a sample of mud or poop, which I did as part of my postdoc at Cornell. I looked at thousands of poop samples, and you apply sequencing technology directly to the DNA that you isolate from that extraction. And then what you get is you get the metagenome. You get everything that's living in the gut, every species, because we tack this back to algorithms that can taxonomically assign the species based on what we know in our genetic data banks. We can ascribe or assign function to the genes that we sequence. And so you can get a really neat picture of not only how, say, the human microbiome is at one point in time, but you can start to collect multiple data points and see the dynamic nature of how the infant gut. So let's say in humans, we're talking about infant microbiome. We're using metagenomics as a practice to understand that. We can use this time-scaled and directed sampling of the infant, and you can start to map changes in the gut metagenome to specific perturbations, like switching from breast milk to formula, introduction of antibiotics, vaccination. So you're like, oh wow, like you can start to measure this dynamic and that's what it really is it's not just our guts, by the way, it's our, our skin. I mean, it's
Mhm.
our sex organs, it's everywhere. We're in this symbiotic nature with these gut
Mm.
bacteria, which I really appreciate now, where, we have our, adaptive versus innate immune systems. My daughter, now 12 weeks old, I really appreciate the value of mom's microbiome as she's building out her immune
Right.
system. Because what we've learned is it really is tailored to the local environment. So to bring it back to like, well, our optimization, how does that become, let's say, actionable? Well, the first thing is, know yourself and know that, you're actually more than the genes in your human cells. You're also a composite of the genes in the bacterial cells as well, because it turns out there's this crosstalk between the metabolites that your bacteria are making that actually affects gene expression at
Mhm.
the organismal level, the human level. So we've seen, for example, you can take people with obese, the microbiome from obese people versus lean people, and you can take
Mhm.
the lean microbiome and put it into an obese person, and you can actually address issues of body weight in that instance.
Mm.
We've seen it also in so there is specifically, the metabolomics of the human microbiome. There's also this whole notion of the gut brain axis as well,
Right.
where different rat models have been used to measure anxiety in rats that were basically put on these sponges on
Mhm.
water and just terrified that they're going to fall in the water, and their microbiomes change into this kind of more pathogenic microbiome over time. And if you actually take that set of bacteria from the stressed out rat and put it into the non-stressed out rat, well, they actually start to elicit that stressed out behavior, right?
Mm.
So what it means about human performance, I think it shifts our perspective around where are my edges as a
Mm.
performing entity, let's say as an athlete. Like,
Right.
what is my body? Are these microbes part of my body? And to the extent that you move the lens out further and further, it's like that notion of an ecosystem scales. And so I think as humans, we start to, let's say, actualize, the more we start to expand our understanding of not just who we are, but who we could become based on understanding these principles.
Mm. It's it's really fascinating. The gut microbiome, it's something that, seems like really over the last few years, people have understood. It's become a lot more popular and just not, and, not just specific demographics, but really as a whole of culture. But as you said, there's so much going on in the microbiome. It's almost hard to fully understand it. And then it seems like genomics, does it get confused a lot with genetics? Because it seems like I believe genetics, I always thought is things like, well, this is just part of me. It's just what I inherited from ancestors, down. It's not something that I could really do anything about. Where genomics seems like it's kind of part of that, but you can actually change this part of your body. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, like you say, genetics deals with the individual genes and their roles in inheritance,
Mhm.
while genomics is more concerned with this collective, characterization and analysis of the material in the organism, let's say, right? And so genomics provides this more global perspective. So you can start to look into things with like not only just genes, but how genes interact with the environment. And so really what we're talking about is gene expression profiles, right? We're talking about transcriptomics, right? So that is the expression of the gene, and that is tied back to, well, things like epigenetics. So DNA methylation, acetylation, chromosome structuring and rearrangement. And so, we know for something, something really interesting, like say, exercise. Like
Mhm.
exercise, we know changes your transcriptomics. Let's just say,
Mhm.
there's anabolic and adaptive processes, pathways that are turned on, and more easily turned on the more you work out.
Mhm.
Conversely, if you smoke, there are more addictive genes that might be turned on versus
Mhm.
dormant otherwise. And we have great historical evidence for this in the instance of the Dutch hunger famine, where mothers who were pregnant and exposed to those conditions of war and famine, we actually see changes in the genome. So not changes in the gene, changes in the let's say the epigenetic profiles
Mhm.
And so therefore the expression preset coming out of the womb, it's like you're actually, if you come from that situation, you're more likely to be obese, and you're more likely
Mhm.
to exhibit obsessive compulsive, that's not the word I'm looking for, is the bipolar schizophrenia. You're more
Okay.
likely to be paranoid, which kind of makes sense if you're growing up in wartime, scarcity and people might kill you. So that to me, it just totally turned everything that I, let's say learned about in high school about genetics on its head. When you learn that, it's kind of an argument for this idea that acquired characteristics can be passed on, which
Right.
was a big no-no as far as Darwin was concerned. It was descent, it was variation, the environment selects, and it's descent with modification.
Mhm.
Now, given the fact that we can rearrange our genomes based on how we choose our environments, is an argument for, well, if your parents were healthful, it's a pretty good chance that you're going to be so inclined to be that way also.
Mhm.
So there's like a new preset in the coding. It's not a change in the base, the individual nucleotides, but it's a change in accessibility to the, let's say, transcriptional profile.
Yeah. How quickly of a change is that? Like with like the Dutch famine and stuff, and they saw like in the genome of infants, like how quickly was that like just like one generation, like they saw an
Yeah.
immediate change?
Yeah. Well, and they measured it and it was lasting. It's measured, I think, one or two generations. I know it's measured two generations
Mhm.
past. Right. So yeah, it's like from the generation. I mean, you think about it, you're doing it now, in terms of what you do. So here we are, we're on this topic of potential
Yeah.
the younger you are, the more quote unquote plastic you are. The more you are as a composite of stem cells, like you could be anything kind of
Right.
thing. But then as you start to differentiate, as some of these things are obviously preset, like, some stem cells become heart tissue, some become muscle, some become liver, kidney, etc. But then how you start to lay down, the tissue, let's say even particular, like your musculoskeletal system, your bone system, like that depends specifically on how you interact with the environment. So, those are expressional optimizations for the ecosystem that you've either chosen or you find yourself in by accident. So it's just really an amazing system at work, and literally happens in your lifetime in terms of specification. That just look at the profile of athletes at the Olympic Games, and
Mhm.
look at the shot putter's body and look at the marathon runner's body and imagine everything in between. And that's all happening in a single generation. Now, those people
Yeah.
aren't all identical. They're going to be coming out with some kind of genetic preset, but that's a heck of a lot of variation in a single species.
Yeah. So kind of
Mm.
looking at that in, an athletic pursuit, like obviously genetics plays a big, role, but what is genome like with an athlete that, we're looking at optimizing that potential and getting into like understanding their genome and their genomics? What are those like, what are the things that it's telling us
Yeah.
about that person? Like, is it telling us about the detriments or like things that they're more inclined to increase their potential on in certain aspects, or how does that work?
Yeah. So as you know, I've worked with quite a few athletes. We were talking about this before we hopped on the
Mhm.
podcast. We were saying, hey, like, close to 100,000 people have listened to your podcast, which
Mhm.
is amazing. If you were to kind of put them all in a single auditorium, you'd be like, wow, like,
Yeah.
I've helped or hopefully helped or affected change of that many people. And the work that I had done previously with Athletigen, we didn't quite get to 100,000, but we empowered more than 10,000, more likely closer to
Mhm.
20,000. Individuals who are interested in optimization and human performance. And we did, some more, let's say, in-depth, evidence-based studies on Olympic level athletes.
Mhm.
That's a piece that I'm working on right now that I definitely want to circle back with you on later.
Sure.
But generally speaking, so out of the box, what listeners might know or have heard about, in terms of, well, what can DNA tell you? Well,
Yeah.
sure, it'll tell you about your genetic predispositions. It'll tell you about your, let's say, your ancestry and your evolution. various personal attributes like your traits, like your eye color, your height, etc. Some more critically important things like medical treatments and drug efficacy. So think like pharmacogenetics, potential for disease, like that is embedded in our genome. And then beyond disease, what do we do for, call it wellness and health optimization? So that's, broad strokes, some of the things that DNA can tell us. But if we look at, let's dive into, say, genetic predisposition. Now, so conventionally, this is what I learned in university, or how I was introduced to genetics, is really, predispositions to certain health conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, or certain types of cancer. And sure, understanding these predispositions can lead to better health management. I want to know things about myself. Not everybody does. It's certainly, you're not motivated to find that out. So
let me interrupt you for a second, just on that. When you talk about that predisposition on there, that's one of those words that like we kind of know, like you're more likely to. But when we see that, like if you have a genetic predisposition, is there a spectrum that we see of like more likely, or because is it like 10%, or because this is, I think, something that gets very confusing for people, like when they say, oh, heart disease is a genetic thing in my family. Like you're starting out with, like you're starting at one. Is there like a spectrum that like we know of when we do these tests?
Yeah. Well, what's getting interesting and controversial at the same time is we're moving into the realm of, let's say, polygenic risk scores, right? So we're looking at multiple markers that are weighted to give you an overall predisposition. Let's just say there are, out of the box, 10 markers associated with, let's use the one that you mentioned, for example, like heart disease. And it's like, you've got 2 of them. It's like, oh, well, I have 2 out of 10. So, well, 20%, is that my predisposition? It's like, well, no, wait, we have to weight those 2 more. Those are the ones that contribute much more. So if we have a weighted algorithm, it's like, well, no, you have a 60% chance of developing this disease. And then you add in the environment. If you consume a high sugar diet, if you consume like a blind, if you do nothing, basically, right? If you live by the status quo, this is your likelihood of heart disease. And so we're going to see much more of this, polygenic risk scores. What I've been thinking more about is polygenic performance scores. So I'm not so much talking about disease now. I'm talking about, the tip of the spear, the athlete who wants that like last 5%.
Right.
And I've drilled that, set of, call it, predispositions down to, let's just say, a top 100. There obviously are going to be more as I add them, but it's like, even reducing it down to like a top 3, and just to kind of start the conversation and make it easier and start to add on. And so you can think about, well, there's different genes like MMP3 gene involved in what type of collagen you lay down, right? Now, depending on which variant you have a higher predisposition to injury. If you are a triple jumper, let's say, you might be more inclined to rupture your Achilles tendon. So like for like if I was only given 3 genes and I was advising an athlete, I would say MMP3. I would, I'd go for the textbook sprint gene, because that's going to affect, how I'm training my, speed, power versus endurance athlete. And then I would go, for, let's just say, a nutrition gene, I'd probably go like MTHFR, because I'm concerned about that inflammatory pathway. I'm concerned about training plateaus. I'm concerned about mood and energy production and inflammation, all those things. And that's, kind of a centralizing pathway. But, that's not the be all and end all. I start to build out around those to get a better picture, of the athlete's presets or predispositions. But, the really exciting thing is coming across athletes who defy the odds or break the mold. Like, I worked with athletes that don't have this I shouldn't say athletes, one athlete that didn't have the sprint gene, but went to the Olympics for the 100 and 200. How does that happen? right?
There's
So
always the outliers. Yeah.
we don't know everything. So that's where, you can throw your hands up in the air as, it's like the non-expert,
Mhm.
because you talk to experts and you push experts hard enough and they'll say, well, we need to do more research. I can't really tell you with any exact
Yeah.
certainty that you will be guaranteed success. But that's why this is evidence based, and this is like, hey, on the whole, what we see is athletes who have a particular variant of, say, their predisposition to
Mhm.
absorb vitamin C, they actually experience higher levels of soreness during phases of higher training load, probably because there's the anti-inflammatory components of vitamin C, but also its role in tissue repair, right? Laying down
Mm.
collagen. So there's really, again, there's good early signal for how, if you're at that kind of sharpening the tip of the spear, how this information can be incredibly valuable to you.
Yeah. So is that like with an example like that of like maybe like predisposed to lower vitamin C or maybe a more risk of injury? Is that something that can be changed? Like, is this something that you can actually work on to not just mitigate, but actually change the genome so that this maybe isn't like a problem anymore? Or is it something that when you know this, it's more of like, okay, I know that I'm more predisposed to this, so I have to work around it more, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's right. And Dave Epstein, I think, summarized it quite well in Sports Gene, the chapter on, I think it's a tale of two high jumpers, right? You have the one guy who's like 5'7", and he's all form and technique. And you have the other guy who's basically a novice, but he's like, 6'5", raw, and they both jump the same height. I can't remember what it is, but the shorter guy developed this like bulletproof Achilles tendon and just like insane efficiency of force production. And it's all
Mm,
about competition. It's all about the 10,000 hour rule. So that's literally an example of somebody climbing to new heights, that you might say did not win the genetic lottery when it comes to high jump,
right.
right? Right. But the interesting thing is, well, again, to take this question a bit further, like on the most basic plane, and that is, injury vulnerability, right? So I have a predisposition to be more vulnerable to injury based on some of these
Mhm.
genetic markers that lay down my collagen. And the interesting thing is when I looked at sort of a few hundred Olympic athletes, those vulnerabilities were overrepresented in that population, or sorry, underrepresented in that population. So what that means is if I take these random sample of athletes, and I take a random sample, or sorry, if I take a sample of 100 athletes, and I take a random sample from the population. In the past, this is cases versus controls, right? So normally the athlete population is like your disease, your cases
Mhm.
population, and the controls are just random, super healthy, normal controls are what they're called. So if we take 100 athletes and compare them to 100 random people who, by the way, have the potential to be athletes, it's just they're not. They're just
Right.
they're
Okay.
they're walking around. What we see in the athletes is an overrepresentation of those injury genes, or sorry, of those injury protection genes. Said
Mm.
another way, there's an overrepresentation of injury genes in the non-athlete populations, which led me to think, well, keep in mind these athletes were all on the track for Olympics. They were older than 20,
Okay.
22, 23, let's say, as old as, let's say, 32. But they all have one thing in common. They'd all made it to the other side of the NCAA, right? Which is no
Survive
hard
that. Yeah.
feat. They survived the NCAA. And they got a little lucky in that regard. Now, here's the interesting thing: is of the 75% that, let's say, were genetically blessed with injury protection, there were 25% that weren't, that were vulnerable, that would be like, say, the random. And what I noticed with that population is, well, they were more inclined to be on the massage table. They were more inclined to be getting prehab. They were more inclined to lower dose training. Because training is this balance of overreaching and
Yep.
adaptation.
Mhm.
So minimum effective dose. Well, if the drug's training, the minimum effective dose for them is better lower, right? And so you would actually have some of these people who are very vulnerably, genetically speaking, who would be overrepresented in terms of getting medals at the Olympic Games because they were so much more dialed into their programs, and had so much more support and attention from their coaches, which
Mhm.
leads us to this, kind of paradigm shift as coaches away from drill sergeants and toward gardeners. Let me understand, let me
Mhm.
nurture your nature, so to speak.
Right. It's
Mhm.
interesting. So the athlete group, they almost have built up almost like a shield for injury versus the other side of the non-athletes.
Well, the athletes, straight up, they're blessed, right? They
Okay.
they they can thank their parents
Yeah.
for their
That's the
gifts.
genetic side. Yeah.
That's the genetic side, and so that really has nothing to do with what they've trained, so to
Sure.
speak. What has more to do with what they've trained, we might look at the training response genes. So
Mm.
some athletes respond more quickly and more favorably, say, to VO2 max training.
Yeah.
Um, and so if that's true, and if the VO2 max is an important part of your sport, say like hockey, for example, and you can train that up within weeks, not months, that gives you a ton of time to work on, say, the speed power component of your sport, the
Mhm.
skills attributes that you want to be working on. So I think what DNA, so in my opinion, in terms of looking into, let's say, the molecules of 10,000 athletes, my opinion is that um, we will see more people accessing more athletes, and even, let's just say, healthletes, like
Mhm.
people who are bringing an athlete mindset to their health. I think you're going to start to see people um, play, let's say, chess with human performance more so than checkers. And what I mean by that is, you take a decathlete, for example. It's very rare that we would see somebody who has all predispositions for, let's just say, endurance, speed, power, anaerobic capacity. That's very,
Right.
very, very, very rare. You'd have some athletes that tended to be along the lines of better jumpers. Some would be more sprint
Mhm.
focused, some more power, like in throws focused.
Mhm.
But it's really about, like, how do I train to bring about the maximum score? Because in decathlon, you don't have to win every event to win the overall.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of
So
manage your weaknesses and maximize your strengths. Mhm.
exactly, and I think that's what we're going to see more and more of in the world of, well, track and field, but also I think team sport as well, where when
Mhm.
you start to see an individual training model integrated into sports like football and hockey, where you start in well, others, baseball, whatever, you start to really honor the unique blueprint and starting point of every athlete,
Mhm.
uh, even though the game itself is universal. But you might actually change the way athletes play the game, because what you're literally doing, if you know your genome better, is you're deliberately placing yourself in an environment to bring about the maximum expression of what you want. And by environment, I'm not just saying, where in the world do you live? I mean, what habits are you uploading as
Mhm.
as part of your operating system, day in and day out?
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the injury side I've always been fascinated by, Jeremy, because especially with like non-contact based injuries and seeing
Yeah.
someone who is such a high quality athlete who has such strength and such power, all of a sudden just the ACL just goes
Oh.
and see from there. So have you seen, is it more like, is there a difference a lot in like the injury prevention genome from male to female? Do you see it more in one sex versus another?
It would be very difficult to reduce it down
Mhm.
to genetics on its, like, of those
Mhm.
particular tissue markers, because there's so much more that's going on in the female biology,
Mhm.
uh, compared to men. Um, but all else equal, let's say that you know uh, a bum MMP3 gene it still requires care, no matter what your sex is.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mhm.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm assuming like body mechanics comes into that as well, just like the different like length. I mean, I always saw that like with length of your femur, like height and stuff like that. I mean, that's gonna all because there's a guy in the Strong First community, oh, I was in the RKC community, Kenneth J, who was like had like a 7.5 foot wingspan, but his
Right.
strength was just like ungodly. It was kind of like an outlier because usually like shorter range of motion, shorter levers, you're gonna develop strength more.
Right, right, right.
Yeah, so it is always interesting to see those outliers.
Yeah, I think that I mean I think that's what DNA allows us to start doing is to um be having those better understanding the let's just say the source, the cause of those outliers.
Mhm.
Um so and that I would say is the interesting thing about, when you talk about the injury vulnerability, or so it really is how the whole organism comes together, right?
Mhm.
So for example, like my background in college, I was a sprinter, and if you actually look at my genetic profile, it's like, yeah, I have the engine of like a monster truck, like sprint engine. I like put on weight easily. Like I just look at weights and I put on, sorry, yeah, I look at weights and I put on, muscle. But it's like the engine's in this like Chevette chassis, because I've had like just so many, like seven or eight different surgeries, like soft tissue
Mhm.
injury. And I'm like, man, wish I had this genetic insight
Mhm.
20 30 years ago, that would help me. I would know where the quicksand is.
Mhm.
If I still wanted to go there because I was, you know let's say, um just too stubborn, then, well, that would be my own fault.
Yeah.
But this whole notion of, prehab, I was thinking about this also, like in terms of like, varsity athletes. Like there's at any given time, there's like 500,000 varsity athletes that are in play. And I can't remember what the stat was. I'd have to double check it, but it's around like 25% of them having some kind of injury. I think it's higher than that. But like of those that get injured, it's like 50% of them will kind of feel that injury for the rest of their life. In
Really?
some, yeah, well, like think about, well, I mean, there's the contact one, so we need to pull those out,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So concussion. So those aren't the ones I'm talking about. I'm
More
thinking like,
non-contact, more, movement
yeah,
compensation type issues.
exactly. I'm thinking labral tears and
Yeah.
pulled hamstrings and rotator cuff issues, and like just, I mean, it's not insignificant. Let's just say that if anybody that does any kind of, let's say, sport above a recreational level, like that's a massive risk for long term,
Mhm.
compensation or injury
Yeah.
as a result. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you
Mhm.
think like is this like do you think this is important for people who are maybe like the healthletes, who are people who are just like maybe not trying to achieve that like next level, but just kind of on the basis like like is this something that you think is beneficial to do like right away, even if you're at like the beginning starting line, or is this something that you think is more powerful, to know about yourself maybe after you've gone through the first initial steps like that everybody knows, like exercise regularly, sleep, like all those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it from the perspective of, okay, well, first of all, we got to just, acknowledge the elephant in the room. Um, a- genetic data, personal data in general, makes a lot of people nervous. Having their personal data
Mhm.
hacked, right? So like, let's just pretend we live on a planet where your data is your own
Everything's
and
safe. Yeah. Mhm.
everything's safe, and health insurance companies aren't going to use your data against you to deny you care or
Yep.
deny
Mhm.
you compensation or insurance. Let's pretend we got all that buttoned up. Um, and now I come back to your question: when is the best time for people to have this information, to know this information? Well, I mentioned to you that my wife and I had our first child, our daughter.
Mhm.
She's like 3 months old today, and yeah, we want to know her genome right
Mhm.
now, because hey, as soon as solid food comes in, I'd like to know what her micronutrient predispositions are.
Mm.
Uh, So think about it even just purely from a nutrigenomics point of view. So like we've, let's just say ruled out all the different possibilities for rare disease. And by the way, they're not insignificant. And they're important to know upfront. I would say that's a separate conversation. But just say everything's healthy and everything's tracking. On the nutrigenomics side, it's like, well, what if she's sensitive to dairy, right? What if she's like her dad, probably is, who doesn't convert beta carotene to vitamin A quite so well, and so is going to turn orange when you give her too much, carrots or squash or whatever. It's like, no, we got to get her vitamin A source from retinol, and that's important because we're developing her immune system, we're developing her skin health. Like there's like, hundreds of decisions that we can be making now every day that if you don't make them or you do them randomly, it's like kind of one of these, well, death by 1,000 paper cuts, which, is like, so that's just purely in terms of, setting our daughter up for success. Like I'm all in on that as a parent, and it's the best intention possible. And that's why I'm doing it. And I found a secure provider. I know we're genome safe, all that. Then let's go to the other side of human performance. There's like the health leads, and let's say I'm now in this health lead mindset where I'm bringing the high performance mindset in terms of everything I do as an entrepreneur, as a consultant, as a coach. I want to be my best for my clients. So day in and day out, I'm making decisions based on my genetics. Like, look, on this call, I have decaf coffee because I metabolize caffeine more slowly. And then, I've got like collagen and some, MCTs because I know, carbohydrates aren't the best for me. And I've got a micronutrient stack here, which is based on my nutrigenomic profile, right? So it's got, the blend of micronutrients for me, that again, if are addressed day in and day out, it's inches and then feet, and then yards and then miles. But it's like, it's really literally, aligning in the day-to-day habits. And, I'll put it this way. It's like, you wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without measuring your foot size.
Right.
Now I know it's more complex and it's overwhelming when you start to look at all the permutations, and you might say, oh, whatever, just give me the heuristic. And that's like totally your choice. But this is becoming more digestible. No pun intended. Right. So, one of the things I do with my entrepreneurs is I coach a select number of entrepreneurs, bringing forward these human performance principles. And one of the first things we do is a biology, kind of overview. And we kind of look at the circadian, distribution of their habits. And we look at their genomes and we say, okay, well, where do we want to be spending our energy based on your job? And then what can we do, knowing what we know about your predispositions, to what would you say, to amplify your energy at those points and increase your longevity and decrease your risk of disease. So that's the health lead side, right?
Right.
And then of course in the middle, there's the athletes, like the day-to-day, which is, how do I get there faster without getting injured and without getting burnt out? And that's like, in that kind of role, I think it's more like you got, it's like a pit stop crew for like an F1 race car where you got to know everything. I got to have all the data about this app because we're talking about hundreds of seconds. So yeah.
I love that. It's, there, as you're speaking there's a quote that I love from Beethoven where he says, do not just practice your art, but force your way into its secrets. And I always love that as change art to life. About instead, don't just practice and just go through from anecdotal things of maybe what you've seen, but really know exactly what's going on with you. People say define your own, your own definition of success. Well, it's the same thing with your health. Like there's so much information out there from other people of what they think you should do. Like, oh, follow this because this person dropped 30 pounds on this diet. Oh, so I'm going to try that. where it might actually not work well for you. And then how many people do this over and over again, and then it doesn't work the same way for them. So then they get discouraged and they get demoralized. And I realized like so much is we're so amped up to go to point B where we want to go and not
Yeah.
actually take the time to say, where are we right now? Like, where is your point A? And I found that when you really do find that and you know what's going on with yourself, with your own genome, with your own body, what works best for you on a strength program or nutrition program, that sense of peace and confidence that you feel of actually knowing it, it might be scary at the beginning, but then
Mhm.
once you get that information out and actually see what's going on with yourself, it is such a powerful tool to have at your disposal. So that's why
Yeah.
I love this aspect of this testing of knowing what's going on in your own body, because it's not just I think this is going on. This is no, this is exactly what's happening within my own body, so you can actually make informed decisions.
Right. Well, you get to this point when you start tracking towards that goal, right? Where, if you ask yourself, and then we were at New Year's resolution time. So
Mhm.
you ask yourself, you say, okay, well, what are some things associated with my goal that I know I'm just gonna absolutely hate, So, if you are if you're a swimmer, for example, I mean, that's just volume, right? And you probably got to get up at like 4:30 every
Yeah.
morning. And it's, well, like when it's 4:30 in the morning, I'm not going to want to do it, right? Or let's just say I'm more likely to hit the snooze button at that point in time. It's like, well, you got to take care of, if I'm Jeremy and I'm a swimmer, I got to take care of future Jeremy. So I got to like put my bag by the door. I got to have my, pre-workout stuff set up. So it's like I know that vulnerability about myself. Or there's a certain workout that I really hate no matter what, but I know it's necessary. And you tie that back to your why, and you can withstand any house, so the saying goes. But yeah, it really is about grabbing the tiger by the tail and just looking it in the eye in terms of your molecular biology. It's like, oh hey, like, yeah, I'm allergic to lactose sugar, and
Mhm.
geez, I really like my latte, but if I don't want to feel this inflamed anymore
Right.
because my Olympic gold medal is better, or I want to have better patience, and so that requires, I sleep better, and this issue with, base level inflammation is affecting my sleep. Well, I mean, again, there are all these like minor things that we can do that have this synergistic output in terms of um, optimization and actualization. Like there's no big thing, right? We all kind of want what's the one thing that I should do? And it's like, yeah,
What is
that's
the
never,
savior that I need? Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but to answer the question, I think it's, well, curiosity about, your potential, like what you come into this world with. Um, I think it is, I think all of us are worthwhile knowing. And genomics gives us a new lens to know ourselves through.
Yeah. With
Mhm.
the entrepreneurs you work with, a lot of people who are listening are solopreneurs. They're in their coaching, practice and building up. And you said the optimizing for like different times. Can our genome and genomics actually look at like what time that you are maybe most energetic or like more focused as well?
Yeah, so it's fairly well studied. There's various clock genes, as they're aptly named, that affect, let's say, your predisposition to be more of a night owl versus a morning bird, let's say. And I think a lot of people probably like they know this already, but it's good to have it confirmed. So for me, for example, I know that I'm a night owl. Um, but given the constraints on my life right now, it's better for me to be a morning bird.
Mhm.
So what do I do to set that up, right? I've got to introduce like much more of a, parasympathetic kind of downloading, down regulating towards the end of my day. So that means like no workouts after 2 o'clock,
Okay.
as an example. Or if it is, it's really, as I say, down regulating. So And you know, like I've done the, you know, self-study on this, and there's all kinds of literature on it. But if I track, for example, my HRV throughout the day, I see peaks and troughs that mirror, you know, let's say the meta-analysis of, you know, how humans tend to perform optimally throughout the day. So generally speaking, what I've observed in myself and what I observe in my entrepreneurs is there are generally two peaks, of cognitive and, you know, physical optimization, through sorry, peak performance, not optimization, but
Mhm.
peak performance throughout the day. So for me, that's generally, you know, between, let's say, I would say 7:30 and 11. So that's like prime time.
Is
And
that
so
peak physically or peak mentally or
that's me. That's more peak cognition.
cognitive? Okay. Mhm.
Yeah. And so, well, guess what? I set up my day so that the habits, you know, for example, there's all kinds of like constant and never-ending improvement work that I'm concerned about, you know, whether that's, you know, reading or knowledge acquisition or
Mhm.
just general, let's say, high performance habits that I pepper throughout the day, to essentially, let's say, embrace those peaks. So it's no different than like an athlete warming up and cooling down. It's like, well, what are your warm up habits? What are your cool down habits? And integrating those into your operating system, because a lot of, so they're basically
Mhm.
those two peaks, and so that means if there's two peaks, then there's three troughs, right? So there's my beginning of the day trough, there's my middle of the day trough, and then there's my wind down trough. And those are just as important, if not more important than, you know, the peak. They actually set up, they're the foundation for the peak state. So it's really working with entrepreneurs to understand, well, what they're doing already naturally, and then leveraging that up, right? You don't want to just like, oh, hey, did you know Wim Hof breathing and cold flushes are good, and I'm just gonna like throw that in your operating system. It's like,
Right.
man, that's, I just put another planet in your operating, in your solar system, and the gravity is like throwing everything all over the place. So, you know, using that kind of biology as a starting point to understand, the
Mhm.
entrepreneur. But of course, there's like a huge, like, let's say, psychology, to performance, which I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
And then there's a strategic planning. So I, you know, I've called this system the, you know, Iris operating system. So it's a way of really seeing yourself, biologically, psychologically, and a vision for the future, right? And I pulled all this together based on, you know, my learnings as an academic,
Mhm.
as an athlete, and as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And you know, what's really cool is you start to work with people, and you get into that effortless effort paradox. It's like, this feels easier, but I'm doing 10 times more. How did this happen? And that's the
Mm.
whole coaching element, coaching people and meeting them where they're at, to nurture their nature. So
Yeah. Can that, have you seen that cognition like change with athletes as well? I was always curious about that because when you go into something like Olympic athletes, right? You might be running a race or doing something at a completely different time than you were normally training or when like your peak function is at. And it's always curious of like how do you train and prepare for that? Now I'm assuming it's like, well, train the best way possible. And then when you get to the when you get to the events, like you've done all the work, you got to just do the best you can. But it seems
yeah.
like that's got to be a challenge as well, for athletes.
Oh, that's a real difficult one. So keep in mind, the use case we were talking about here was like entrepreneurs who, you know, they, you know, I'd like to say they set their own schedule, but usually when I start working with them, they don't, or they say they can't because, you know, they're at the whim of, you know, deadlines, raising capital, investors,
Right.
product
Yeah.
launch, et cetera. And it's like, well, that may be where you are right now, and let's navigate through that, but let's set up a better operating system so that we can put, um, you know, the work into, the times that where you are most optimal. So for example, if you're going to do a press release, we're not going to do that, let's say in the morning where you're doing that deep work, because you're just not as personable, right?
Mhm.
You're out there in the public, and so the best time for you to do that is around 4 o'clock, and here are the activities that you want to do before that to give you peak state, because this is potentially $100 million conversation you're about to have.
Mhm.
um, so entrepreneurs can, if they get proactive enough, control, when they do the work that they do, but not always. And but in the case of athletes, it's like they can almost never control it,
Yeah.
right? You know, like I worked with a lot of NHL players, you know, like over a decade ago,
Mhm.
and you know, I would have them for around 13 weeks, and I would build these beautiful high performance systems just to like maximize, you know, how they might be actualized in those 13 weeks. And they'd go back to training camp and they'd feel optimal, and they'd crush all of their team testing, and you know, they'd get onto the lines that they wanted to, and you know, contract negotiations were awesome. And so then the issue becomes, once they started to get into season, they'd start to call me and they say, well, look, like our trainer is telling us to do this, but that's not in line with what you were saying. And you know, these games are killing me, these road trips to that. I'm like,
Mhm.
look, like we've done the work for this 12 weeks to get you optimal. And if you do these habits throughout the season, you should be able to make it to game 7. You
Right.
won't be optimal, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because because we're into playing the game of survival, right? But given the conditions, well, actually, you are optimized, because we compensated for the fact that, oh, you know, you have to play. Well, you have all these time changes and you have all these late games, you know, and oh, well, you made it into the All-Star game. Well, you know, those are all variables that we have to correct for. So it becomes it's a conversation that
Yeah.
that athletes need to have with their bodies and with their support team, because
Yeah.
there is a way through. There are all of those high performance habits, that, I mean, you look at a guy like Tom Brady is a perfect example, right?
Mhm.
So far as the extension of his career, I mean, unheard of. But you know, and you look at guys like, you know, uh, Nolan Ryan, Tommy John, right? Like these are
Yeah.
people who they don't accept no for an answer. Um, and so what they're doing is they're really getting to know themselves in the
Right.
environment of their chosen sport.
Yeah.
Right.
I love
Yeah.
that. That's a beautiful distinction of optimization, because I think we often think optimization means you're always at this level, when in
Right.
reality, optimal is going to be a spectrum. And when you have things that you can't control, like for an athlete, you're going on road trips, you're getting in a hotel at 4 a.m., and then you got to play a game at 1 p.m. the next day on there, versus the same, a brand new father with a 3 month old who all of a sudden, I'm sure
Yeah.
there's things that you can't control with that time. So as kind of going back, the more you know yourself of where your predispositions are, the more you can, I always think it's like the more you can become proactive versus reactive in your solutions, the more you're going to have, a good idea of what you can do at any given time, regardless of the things that you can't control.
Yeah. You know what you're saying, I mean, it really hits home right now, just because of, you know, where I am with my own priorities, and that is, you know, more on being a supportive husband and yes, father. But like, let's face it, we're just coming to the end of the 4th trimester, where it's really just like, how do I be supportive?
Right.
But you know, like I've the let's say trials and tribulations of the path that I described to you, like academic, entrepreneur, is just loaded with ups and downs and uncertainty. And you know, one of the things I've learned is that you don't get anywhere without this integrity of being. And so, like, to come to your point around balance, right? It's like, well, it's not so really balance. It's more integration
It's a
and
harmony. Yeah.
harmonization, yeah, of these, you know, I call them like personalities. And I've done enough, you know, self-study and study of psychology to have emerged these, you know, these personalities that I need to, you know, basically intercalate and balance, as well, not balance, and harmonize as it relates to the time I'm at in my life. So you might ask what those are. It's like, well, it has to do with your career and your job. Um, it has to do with, you know, well, you know, ideally you have some kind of relationship, some meaningful relationship at the top. So right now it's, you know, my partner, and you know, we've got family that's important. You know, hopefully you've got like some activity that you do that is also downtime, but it also complements, you know, what it is that you're tracking towards. So it's getting to the crux of aligning all those things. So like the person I am at work wouldn't be a surprise to my daughter, and how I am with my children wouldn't be a surprise to my my colleagues, let's say. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially in the extremes. Like entrepreneurs tend to over index on the result, raising the capital, exiting the business. Same is true with athletes, and they're not thinking, let's say, fourth dimensionally. They're not thinking through time, and they're not thinking of themselves as a community. It's like, well, who Jeremy is today is very different than Jeremy 20 years ago. It's going to be very different Jeremy 20 years from now. How are the decisions that I make today good for Jeremy of the future, and having learned from Jeremy of the past? And I think, again, the genetics is genomics. Your blueprint is part of that, right? So the decisions that I'm making today, previously I was focused on high performance. Now I'm focused more on longevity, but I would have rather have before been focused on performance longevity. So and I think that's what genomics can give us.
Yeah. So how does someone, if they're interested in getting their understanding their genomics and stuff, like how do you actually go about doing this DNA test? I know you do a service in there. Is this something that you can go to your doctor and say, I want to test for these things, or is this a specific thing that you can go and get at a certain place?
Yeah. So where I offer this, it isn't sold in retail, and I'll say that, I had done this previously with the previous venture, Athletigen, where, I would say, okay, well, here's your athletic report and here's your nutrition report. And I just found that the results were too static. And unless you had a coach to help you interpret it, it might be doing more harm than good. And so if I bring genomics into my coaching, well, I bring other experts to the table, and it's a comprehensive approach. So really the best way to do is to contact me. And if people are interested, I can point them in the direction of what our first step might be together in terms of looking at you holistically. And so yeah, because otherwise I would be recommending things like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and it's just those are not going to give you the insight that we're talking about here in terms of sharpening the spear. Now, in terms of whole genome sequencing, I do use sequencing.com, full disclosure. I do business development consulting for that company. I believe in that company, and they don't sell your data. As I mentioned, it's whole genome. But keep in mind, I'm looking at it as an expert, right? So, I mean, people are definitely encouraged to go and check out what they've got there. They've got the whole, first of all, the whole genome sequencing versus, partial sequencing. Like 23andMe offers, let's say, a couple 100,000 markers. Whole genome is the full, 3 billion, right? So you're going to get the most comprehensive overview to start. But again, that can be daunting. Now, there is a marketplace where you can check out your nutrigenomics, and you can check out, I think there's some athletic reports there as well. But here's what's going to happen is you're going to, if you're a do-it-yourselfer, you might love it because it's a whole constant and never-ending improvement thing. But you'll probably spend, years, before you get to the point of, let's just say a comprehensive operating system. So I believe that the human is very much integral to that. Now, I do leverage, AI and genomics as part of the service. But again, it's, I partner with my clients to get to their optimization. And so generally it's not just like, hey, here's your DNA, see you never. It's part of a comprehensive, onboarding process in terms of, understanding how you got to where you are, getting super clear on where you're going, and then, leveraging performance periodization principles to get you there based on your biology. So short answer is, I'll give you my email. I'm sure you can share it. It's just Jeremy at irisinfinity.com. Mhm.
Beautiful. That's what I was going to say right there is let's get that contact information. Dr. Jeremy, thank you so much for jumping on today. This has been fascinating. I think this is the stuff that, as I said before, like so many people were always looking for where we want to go. These are the goals that we want to have without really taking the time to knowing where you are at this moment. Who are you? Not just in a existential or an ethereal type way, but actually knowing like what is your makeup? Like what is it? And I think this is one of those things that the more people understand and the more people get to know, then they can make informed decisions about what they can do so they can not only live healthy but really optimize their health. And I think it's one of those things too, like we don't know how we feel optimally until you get there. Like it's a hard thing to describe from there. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing and jumping on today.
Well, I appreciate you having me. Pleasure to be here, Michael.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we got your email. Any other place people can go and follow your content? Anything else that you're putting out?
Yeah, I mean, I am working gradually towards this, the human performance of DNA story. So this is going to be, in the 10 years in entrepreneurship, working very closely with athletes. I'm trying to turn that into, a storyboard that, at least in concept can be more interesting and digestible to people as it relates to the DNA of human performance. So I'm not sure how I'm going to be disseminating that, but I am building it. It might be a combination of podcast or YouTube series, but you can find me at drjeremykoenig.com. Spoiler alert, it's really just a web page placeholder, but if you're interested, you can sign up. And I'm looking to build that tribe of enthusiastic followers that are really interested in understanding how DNA is going to shape our future, because there's a ton of things that we didn't touch on today in terms of, well, what future might that be in the presence of AI. And we got some real kind of moral and ethical conundrums to talk about for another day, I'm sure.
I think that's a part two that we'll have to, set up and dive into. So
I'd love that.
awesome. All right, Jeremy, thank you so much. Listeners, thank you so much for connecting. I'll catch you guys on the next one.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found some great value here. And if you like this episode, please drop a comment and leave us a 5-star rating and review. It does more to build the show than you can imagine. And do not forget to check out and join the Strength Connection Facebook group. In this group, I share the biggest takeaways and lessons from these amazing conversations, as well as training and strength tips for pursuing mastery and fulfillment in life. This group is filled with individuals looking to take full control over their strength, and it's the perfect space to explore new ideas and to share your journey. And you'll also get exclusive access to these Strength Connection Mastery Seminars. It's a deep dive into the physical, mental, and spiritual training that you can begin using immediately. So do not wait. Go now. Seriously, go. All right, much love to you. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you on the next one.